Welcome to this week's Parsha class. Just a quick word of warning that there are lots of difficult themes in this week's Parsha, and Aviva Zornberg explores them in what I think is a very thoughtful and sensitive way, but just wanted to put it out there. And I realized that there's only one more week, Bahar B'chukotai, in our Vayikra Aviva Zornberg series. I knew that it would fly by because with Pesach in the middle, it gets all sort of choppy, but it's hard to believe it. It has made Vayikra, at least for me, much more enjoyable than I sometimes feel it is in the past. Okay, so I was very drawn to this chapter, even with its difficult themes, because it is, I think, an interesting story, and stories are so far and few in between in Sefer Vayikra. Here, let me share my screen. And that is certainly how Aviva Zornberg starts. Let me make it a lot bigger for everybody.
Could the type be made a little larger? Oh, yes.
Yes, can you
Much
see now?
better.
That's much
That's
better.
much better.
Okay, good. This is what I call the Tamar Zoom. I always hear your helpful voice when I look at a small text online. Okay, so Aviva Zorberg jumps right in, right? She says, two men get into a fight. One of them blasphemes. He is brought to Moshe for judgment, and the case is resolved only when God sentences the blasphemer to death. Since there are only two narratives in the book of Vayikra, the other is of the death of Aaron's sons, which we unfortunately missed because it was a pre-Pesach, or I think it was maybe even a Yontif night that was that Tuesday. Um, but she talks about that narrative too. It is striking that in both, the reader receives a similar kind of narrative shock. In the context of divine revelation, a disruption occurs, an act of violence. In one case, the strange uncommanded fire. In the other, the fight that generates blasphemy. In both cases, the death of the protagonists ends the disorder that they have provoked. So I thought that was a fascinating analogy that I had not realized. First of all, to realize there are only two narratives, and they are both filled with trauma and tragedy is interesting, right? Especially in a book that is supposed to bring us closer to Hashem through Korbanot. It's just, I think it's just worth maybe sort of noting that these two stories are so sad and so can maybe create such distance between us and Hashem, this kind of violence and disruption. Okay, and then she will compare it to one other story, which I think is interesting later, but these are the two in Vayikra. And she continues, violence suddenly enters the world. Always there is surprise, the feeling of a world disfigured. Why the blasphemy in the midst of a fight? The enduring repetition of surprise, Lear remarks, is the course of a discussion about tragedy. May eventually suggest that there is something about human destructiveness which lies beyond logos. These are moments when we suspect that all this carnage has happened for no reason at all. I'll not admit to understanding the full quote to its full extent. If anyone has ideas, I'm open to them. Um, but I think that this idea that when violence enters the world, there is this feeling of a world disfigured, sort of building off that conversation about Yom Ha'atzmaut, right? I think this is a world that is far more violent than we might have remembered in the near past. I don't know. I would be curious how you guys feel, being much wiser than I am in the ways of history. But I was not born until after World War II, right? The Gulf War was like my first experience. I think that in some ways, because of the news cycle, we end up being much more exposed to the violence of the world now than we used to, maybe is the way to put it. But that idea of the surprise and feeling of a world disfigured felt very resonant to me, I guess is what I would say. The phenomenon of the unfathomable is intensified in the second story, where judgment is delayed. The blasphemer is kept in prison until sentence can be passed by the mouth of God, according to Rashi, because they did not know if it was a capital offense or not. No one knows what to think, what to say about this act of blasphemy. Never explicitly forbidden until it actually happens, it shocks the reader as much as the other protagonists. Looking more closely at this strange short story, we notice many anomalies. The blasphemer is described as going forth, vayetze, but from where? He is identified as the son of an Israelite woman. Why single her out as such, if not to signal that his status as an Israelite is not as straightforward as it looks? We hear next that he is also the son of an Egyptian man. His hybrid identity is emphasized as the fight breaks out between him and an Israelite man. In this way, the reader is taken through a series of anomalies. Born of an impossible union between oppressor and slave, the mixed breed fights the purebred. Evidently, the son of an Israelite woman is the focus of the reader's interest. It is he who goes forth into the midst of the Israelites, and it is he, the son of an Israelite woman, three times described as such, who articulates the divine name and curses. Thereafter, he is referred to as the one who cursed, Hamekalel. He remains unnamed, as do his mother and father and his foe in combat, until he is taken into custody, when his mother is suddenly named. There is, however, another possibility. Perhaps the story is told from the viewpoint of the Israelite man, the man of straightforward Israelite identity. It is he who experiences the intrusion into the camp of an outsider who has gone forth from elsewhere. An anomalous presence in camp interrupts the life of the normative Israelite. A fight ensues and a blasphemy. Right, so I think that's an interesting idea to think about which perspective the story is being told from. Is it told from the perspective of the person for whom that experiences disruption in the camp, provokes a fight, and then experiences this sort of strange act of verbal violence? Or is it told from the perspective of the person who is disrupting camp simply through his own existence and when provoked ends up blaspheming God? It's not clear, right? It could be understood from either viewpoint, I think is her perspective. Rashi tells the hidden midrashic story. The blasphemer had gone forth from the law court of Moshe, which had ruled against him. When he had come to pitch his tent in the midst of Dan's encampment, he had been asked, "Who are you to camp here?" He had replied, "I am of the descendants of Dan." He had been told, "But it is written, each man camps by his flag according to the insignia of his father's house." Then he had gone to court, and Moshe had ruled against him. So he had risen up and blasphemed. So Rashi is giving us like the why, right? What would push someone to blaspheme Hashem in this way? And Aviva Zornberg goes on to explain what was the thing, right? What is the story in the Midrash? It explains both the fight and the blasphemy. Since he has mixed parentage, his situation is complicated. As the son of an Israelite mother, he is an Israelite, but his place in the Israelite camp is regulated by patrilineal descent principle, according to his father's house. He finds himself disqualified from taking his place in the social political world, the flags and insignia of the Israelite camp. Where is he to put himself? In this crisis, he names God and curses, right? So because everyone camps according to their father's house, this man is sort of homeless effectively in the camp because he's not welcome in his mother's tribe of Dan, but his father doesn't have a tribe. He's Egyptian. And so this feeling of displacement leading to the cursing, I think is a very like sort of modern interest story, right? What pushed the Israelite, the non-Israelite, or the son of an Israelite woman to curse God? It was this feeling of social isolation, right? Of displacement, of like sort of not belonging anywhere in the world, which I think hopefully gives us a lot of empathy for the blasphemer, right? When we don't understand the why, it's easy to just understand him as like a sort of a violent man. But once we understand the why, we feel hopefully some compassion to feel that there is a reason, that there's a true pain in the blasphemer's heart, the Mikalkel's heart as well. Okay. Why is this disturbing narrative recounted in the Book of Holiness, right? Why are we putting this in Sefer Vayikra? I think that's like, um, a super interesting question. Why does it belong here? By definition, blasphemy is an abhorrent act, an ugly, obscene use of language. For some commentators, the natural reaction to such an utterance would have been to lynch the offender. Recourse to a court of law introduces doubt into the story. It is, after all, not clear how to evaluate the offense. Only God can decide the matter. But why the uncertainty around this act? Surely words that deface the divine presence in the world are to be judged most gravely. An ambiguity seems to attend this offense, which is absent from the closest parallel case, the act of the wood gatherer who profanes the Shabbat. Right, so this story we will read, we have not read it yet. The story of the Mikoshesh Eitzim, the person who gathers wood on Shabbat, he too is sort of sent into jail for a short time, just like the Mikalkel. But what Aviva Zornberg is saying is the ambiguity in that case is a different kind of ambiguity, right? That act is read by the rabbis as clearly deserving of the death penalty, gathering the sticks, without any of the uncertainty that happens, that attends our story. On the one hand, the sin of blasphemy is considered so grave that the words spoken cannot even be mentioned in the text, right? It's interesting. It doesn't say what the Mikalkel says, it just says that he said it. According to Talmudic law, even the witnesses who must testify to the words by uttering them in court may only do so in a private session with the judges. In open court, a euphemism is word used. It's like the actual words may not be articulated. It's like you could imagine like the beeping on TV, right? So even when you're in the sort of the more private space of the courtroom, you have to say he said gosh darn, right? The euphemism, the euphemistic version of the cursing. Um, Maybe because the words are so offensive, or maybe I think because, as she says here so beautifully, the gravity of the words makes them literally unspeakable. It's like it would pain the speaker to have to carry such heavy words in his or her mouth. And yet, the same Talmudic passage excludes the blasphemy of a non-Jew from this morning response. Else, all their clothes will be in tatters. I think it's a fascinating idea, right? It's a sarcastic comment on the commonplace nature of blasphemies in the non-Jewish world. Sort of the like the harsh language that non-Jews use is different than the sort of refined language that Jews use. I think it's maybe that was true in the time of the Gemara. I'm not sure it's true now. I think that often people who study holy text or are more observant do not swear, but I would gather that that runs across religious groups. Um, I certainly can't attest to this today. This idea that utterances, swear words, right, violence against the deity are trivial, maybe in some places. Perhaps because of this ambiguity, blasphemy as outrage or part of the linguistic order, the case needs to be referred to God himself. Apparently, the verdict depends on how his identity, the Israelite or non-Israelite, is defined. How does God view the profanity of God's name, viewed from the perspective of a normative son of an Israelite man? The intrusion into the camp of an outsider, a man of mixed breed, arouses fear and disgust. However, it is the Israelite man who, by calling his mother a zonah, a harlot, provokes the mixed breed to blaspheme. In doing so, he exposes a scandalous story from the past. He therefore bears some responsibility for the blasphemous reaction of the woman's son, who is, after all, defending his mother's reputation. The act of exposing the traumas of the past is in itself a grave misuse of language. I thought that was beautiful, and it tied back into our conversation about reminding the convert about his past life. I don't know if you guys remember that. That was back in the mitzvah of the day, not in Aviva Zornberg, but in Parshat Shemot, I think it was Parshat Mishpatim, we talked about not reminding people of past behaviors, that was like a very grievous crime to say like, oh, remember when you used to eat shrimp to a convert, right? Um, and so similarly here, it seems like saying like, remember that horrible thing that happened to your mother is a grave misuse of language, the exposing of the traumas of the past. But why does the blasphemer attack God rather than cursing the Israelite who provoked his rage? Right? Great question. If someone attacks you, you usually would say like, I hate you, not I hate God. Chas v'shalom. The Midrashic plot thickens. The blasphemer's mother, named Shulamit, was the wife of an Israelite taskmaster in Egypt. Right? So Shulamit is married to a nice Jewish boy. He was sent on a mission with his Egyptian superior, and the latter, the Egyptian superior, took the opportunity to enter the Israelite's home and have relations with his wife. In one version of the story, she is declared to be innocent. She thinks she is with her husband. We'll leave that to another class, another discussion. In other versions, she is assumed to be complicit. The son who is born of this encounter is the future blasphemer.
Oh.
Right? The plot really does thicken. Right. And
Hmm.
again, I guess there's also something that I think like Aviva Zornberg is modern, so it's not surprising, but this act of sort of peeling back the layers to understand why things happen the way they do feels very modern. Right? The text of the story is so sparse. The Torah doesn't tell us, well, this poor child is the product of rape. Or, well, he had nowhere to be in the camp, right? We don't hear any of the backstory. But the Midrash, it's very important to the Midrash to fill in these gaps, to understand what would drive someone to become a Mikalkela, a blasphemer. The trauma of such origins, of a rape or an act of fraternization between oppressor and oppressed, is linked with the moment when Moses first leaves the palace. So if you remember back to the story of Shemot, right, where Moshe grows up in the Paro's palace, and then in pretty early on, right, in Perek Bet, he goes out and he sees the suffering of Bnei Israel, and he encounters this Egyptian overseer who's abusing a slave, right? And he kills the Egyptian, right? That there's like sort of two acts to this violent story. That's act one. And so what Aviva Zornberg says is that the Midrash, I was just telling someone today that the rabbis liked, I think it's called an economy of characters, right? No anonymous characters. Like Eved Abraham must be this character Eliezer, right? We don't like for there to be extra sort of vague, bland characters. So who is this Egyptian that is attacking a Hebrew slave? It is none other than the father of the blasphemer, the adulterous Egyptian father of the blasphemer. And who is the Hebrew slave he's abusing? It is the betrayed Israelite husband who is persecuted by the Egyptians. So this becomes actually not a story of like national oppression, but a story of a very intimate family story playing out, right? The boss, the oppressor, sends away the Israelite man so that he may have um, relations with that man's wife, which of course sounds traumatically like a story of a Jewish king later on in our history. And when the man comes back, the Egyptian starts to push him around. Moshe kills the Egyptian for all his abusive behavior in the house and in the field. He lifted his eyes up to God and said, is it not enough that the wicked man abused his wife, but he's also beating up her husband? Immediately he smote the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Oh dear. Everything okay over there?
It's Chicago. Oh.
Is that okay? Tornado warning? What is it?
That was the telephone. I'm ignoring it.
Oh, okay. um, right. So Moshe seemed to understand this, that there was this like internal family systems issue playing out here. And he kills the Egyptian because he says, I'm killing him not only because he's abusing this Israelite, but because he was abusing the wife of this Israelite yesterday, right? In the house and in the field. It helps us understand what that means. The next day, Moshe encounters the two Hebrews fighting. When he intervenes, one of them taunts him, who appointed you as authority or judge over us? And now we're picking up on a very small thing where it says, do you intend, but literally, do you say to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So what does it mean? Do you intend to say to kill me as the Egyptian? Or do you say to kill me? For this reference to killing by speech, Rashi notes we learn that Moshe had killed the Egyptian by uttering the explicit name of Hashem. So that is a fascinating plot development, right? Not only do we learn the backstory of this, the blasphemer's father and the blasphemer's mother's husband, but we also learn that the blasphemer maybe was present, understands the power of cursing Hashem, that it has the power to kill someone else. Okay. This traumatic history includes sexual abuse, physical brutality, killing, and the violent use of the divine name. The offspring of this situation is the future blasphemer, the son of the abused mother and of her abuser. Moshe has killed the blasphemer's father and now excludes the son from a place in the Israelite camp. The son defends his mother's honor and curses the divine name that had been used against his father. Right? It helps us understand the why in a very deep way. But now we take a little step back and say, why tell this story at all? Just as it might have been better in the first place if the Israelite had not confronted the blasphemer, so it might have been better to censor the whole violent story. And there are many Mefarshim who say that. Like it's an uncomfortable story that's not necessary to advance the plot of Bnei Israel. Why tell the story? So Aviva Zornberg answers, in a sense, telling the story, even in its stark, repressed biblical form, is itself a kind of blasphemy. However, if in fact the blasphemy happened, the framing of a law is necessary to regulate future cases. The case history precedes and justifies the law and must there be recovered in all of its ugliness. In this case, the violent midrashic narrative with its linking biblical clues affects the reader in complex ways. On the one hand, the background narrative may alienate the reader, the unspeakable becoming the unthinkable. But on the other hand, the same narrative may invoke empathy with the human situation of the blasphemer. Complex themes arising from this narrative bear a primal intensity that invites a psychoanalytic reading. In order to discuss these complexities, we will need to go deeper into the thicket. Without articulating the blasphemy, we will have to understand it. Okay, I brought one more section, but if anyone has thoughts or ideas, I'm happy to listen now, or we can save it for the end.
I think
Okay.
a lot of the stories in the Torah are based in learning, so that even people today in 2026 can learn from the behavior of the people in the biblical stories. And then there's
Yes, I think that's a great point, right? It's yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then there's comments and rabbinic discussions about all kinds of behavior that you find in the Bible from the people who lived then that really still have bearing on some situations in the world today.
Yeah. It reminds me of that term to fail forward. I don't know if you've heard that term, but it's like this idea that if you fail, it's okay as long as you do it in a forward momentum. Like you learn from the thing so you can change your behavior in the future. And so even if it's an uncomfortable situation, it's sort of redeemed by the value of its lesson. And I hear you saying that, and I agree, Sherry, right? That we tell this uncomfortable story to help us fail forward, to help us understand how to welcome in someone who doesn't fit into the paradigm of the camp, how to address the injustices and the traumas of his childhood. And I think that's 100% right. I totally agree. And it doesn't make the story easier, right? But it makes it equally important to tell. And maybe even, coming on the heels of Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, I think we can certainly understand that idea, right? That we can't forget or ignore the ugly parts of our history. I think that's a beautiful point. Okay. So here in this section, she talks about what is the blasphemy? What is this of Hashem? So it is striking that the law of blasphemy is immediately followed by the law of murder. Anyone who strikes down a human life shall be put to death. The natural context of blasphemy apparently is murder and violent bodily injury. Here Sforno asks, why in this context do we find twice the statement, the stranger is to be treated exactly like the citizen, once in reference to the blasphemer and once in reference to murder? An analogy is being suggested. Blasphemy is a kind of murder, but who is the victim? The Sforno points to the gravity of blasphemy, raising the possible objection that we have noted. That is, after all, commonplace in the world, and therefore the fact of the blasphemer's mixed parentage might have constituted an extenuating circumstance. After all, Jewish law, even in this passage, assigns different outcomes in different circumstances. Whether it is a human being or an animal that has been killed or injured, or whether it is one's parents or someone else who has been injured. But in these two cases, blasphemy and murder, circumstance makes no difference. Kager, ka'ezrach, stranger and citizen alike, for I, God, your God, am the God of both stranger and citizen. In these two cases, there is a gravity that transcends situational difference. Blasphemy is both commonplace and repulsive, but the gravity of the offense becomes clear only after the divine verdict has been delivered. Before that, gravity and triviality hang in the balance undetermined. If it happens so commonly, perhaps it can be viewed as venial. How then are we to understand the sin of blasphemy? Sforno quotes Yeshayahu, and it will be when they suffer hunger, they torment themselves and curse by their king and by their God. This refers to the chronic anger of the poor who are angered by everything that happens to them. Cursing and blasphemy is an expression of a general exasperation with life. When one is suffering, there's a natural impulse to turn against the authority, whether human or divine, who is seen as the source of oppression. Right? And I think that is how many people sort of use swear words in the common modern world. It's like escape valve, like a pressure escape valve, right? A way of expressing that exasperation. I'm so angry, I have to use this bad word to show how angry I am, right? In a different context, the Ramban suggests that the sin offering of the repentant leper, so moving backwards to Parshiot, into Parshat Metzora, is atonement for any expletives, the tifla Elokim, he may have uttered in the painful process of his cleansing. Such a minor expletive is natural in the circumstances but needs atonement. I think just the way that she weaves all of these parshiot together, she helps us understand the way the Ramban and the Midrash weave all these parshiot together, is beautiful, right? What is the sin of the Metzora? Maybe it's not the sin offering is not for whatever got him into that Metzora status, right? Lashon hara or withholding things from his neighbor or whatever it is, but it is the fact that while he was painfully being cleansed of his Metzora status, he might have sworn, and that swearing deserves atonement. The same expression, tifla Elokim, occurs in Eov, right? Eov is a story of terrible loss. In spite of all of his losses at the beginning of the story, nevertheless, Eov did not sin, nor did he ascribe anything unseemly to God. The word tifla seems to represent this venial offense, a meaningless cry of frustration. When, however, Eov is later afflicted with leprosy, the issue of blasphemy appears in full force. His wife urged him to end it all by uttering blasphemy. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Blaspheme God and die. Right here, blasphemy is a kind of suicide or euthanasia. It's like if you want the divine lightning to come down and strike you, you should blaspheme God, and then you'll be taken care of. What is undoubted is its destructive effect. Eov responds with the contempt for his wife's moral and spiritual weakness. You speak like one of the Nevalot, the primitive women. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? For all of this, Eov did not sin with his lips. But Eov's integrity, his moral strength, is expressed in his restraint. But Rashi reevaluates his silence. But in his heart, he did sin. He avoided the sin of blasphemy, which is verbal, castigating his wife for even talking about blasphemy. But in his heart, he did sin. Emotionally, though not verbally, blasphemy has in some way claimed a place in his inner life. Right? So cursing is all about, it seems, this doubt of Hashem or this anger at Hashem for what has befallen us. Okay, sorry, I lied. There's one more beautiful section. What then is blasphemy in the heart? Hatred is the emotion that motivates both violence in the action, the makah, and blasphemy in language. Anger, frustration at injustice, disappointment at one's personal fate, or more generally at the apparent moral chaos of the world, all can be subsumed in this impulse of hatred. I had not thought of cursing as sort of an act of hatred, but I find her very compelling. That it could, right, just as like good feelings can often lead to more good feelings, right, gratitude to more gratitude. I find this idea compelling that when you say like sort of angry and hurtful and hateful words, it can continue to cause more chaos in your life. Freud thought of hatred as the ego state that wishes to destroy the source of its unhappiness. In the life of the young child, this refers to the external world that in some way threatens his internal world. At the very beginning, the external world objects, and what is hatred are identical. So now she quotes a pasuk from Devarim. If a person who hates another lies in wait for him and sets upon him and strikes him in a fatal blow. The law addresses the fatal blow of the makeh, right, the person who hits someone, but traces it to his hidden root of hatred. Rashi comments, because of his hatred, he comes to the point of ambush and murder. From here, they said, if one transgresses a light commandment, then one will, in the end, transgress a weighty one. Like the butterfly effect that triggers chaos, the light transgression of hatred will inevitably find its outlet in murder. In what sense is hatred a light offense, right? We might think that's actually a grave offense. Similarly, strikingly, the command against hatred is cited from Vayikra a few chapters earlier, before the blasphemer narrative. In a powerful passage that deals with hatred and love, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. This is unexpressed hatred. It is precisely repressed hatred that has such toxic effects. Better to rebuke your brother so as not to bear sin for him in your heart. Repressing animosity is not a virtue. Here it is expressly forbidden. It is its pathological potential is evident. However, the call to rebuke the other turns out to be in its own way just as problematic. It is a skill that is easy to get wrong, says the rabbis. Better not to practice it at all if one cannot do it well. It does become a bit of like a catch-22, right? Don't feel it in your heart, but also don't express it too strongly. And like sometimes we have feelings, and I think that that's okay. So it is a difficult line to walk. Seemingly light, unimportant, the ban on hatred in the heart arises from the one who commands it. Know who commanded it, and let it not be light in your eyes. I am God. The lightness is only in human eyes. It gains mass and weight from the divine presence, right? What a beautiful idea. That Hashem sort of weighs it down. We might think it's no big deal, but it is one. Be as careful with a light commandment as with a weighty one. In this sense, there is no intrinsic difference between the two. Even though hatred does not express itself physically or verbally, it contains the potential for the most violent expressions. These violent expressions are forbidden. But how can the lighter prohibition of hatred in the heart be forbidden? If an emotion is inherent, can it be forbidden? In rabbinic thought, the contradiction is only apparent. The assumption is that primal, commonplace destructiveness can in some way be managed. The Rashbam demonstrates this paradoxical logic, for instance, when he comments on the exhortation against cursing judges. Many people curse kings and judges when they do not attain their desire. Therefore, we are warned against this. You shall not curse judges. The logic is clear. The reason for the prohibition to curse judges is precisely because it is a common practice. Therefore, it represents a substantial target for legal intervention, right? Hashem is not saying, oh, by the way, don't do this thing that might never occur to you to do. Hashem is saying, wow, this feels like this might actually be a very common problem, and so I'm going to be very explicit about it. Right here again, the logic is laid out with empirical clarity. Cursing kings and judges is such a commonplace practice because they have the power to rule on existential issues, capital punishment, and financial damages. Since one stands to lose one's property or even one's life in the wake of such rulings, anger, resentment, and despair are a natural reaction to losing one's case. The curse is an expression of hatred of authority and of those who wield it. Its grounding in a common resentment ties emotion and behavior together. Implicitly, this bundle of hatred and cursing is understood to be a natural human response, which the Torah law prohibits. So this is the end. I did not bring this next section. It's just the end of the page, so it showed up here. But I think I very much appreciate the way Aviva Zornberg lays out sort of like the trauma history, and then also the instinct to curse things that are difficult or that cause us anger, and the reasons to be extra careful to guard against it. And as Sherry said, I think she brings it into a very relevant place where it doesn't feel like a sort of random story from the past. It feels very much like something we too should be worried about, guarding ourselves against. But I definitely welcome other thoughts or ideas if anyone. Okay. Well, it was so lovely to see all of you tonight. I hope you have a wonderful end of your week. I look forward to wrapping up this Sefer from Aviva Zornberg next week, and then we'll decide if we'll go back to the mitzvah of the week or maybe move on to something else. But as always, it has been a pleasure to learn Torah together. I hope everyone has a warm end of your week and an early Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.